All right, diving right in. Today on the deep dive, we're tackling something, it's called the Autism Imposter Syndrome Paradox. And,
Sure.
well, it's pretty common. A lot of people feel like frauds sometimes, especially when things are going well. But we've gotten a ton of research from you guys suggesting that. This feeling, it's like way more common among autistic individuals. And we've got this whole stack of articles and research you sent over. So today we're going to try to figure out why that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, what the impact of feeling like an imposter is. And, well, most importantly, what you can do about it if you're dealing with this.
Yeah, it's really interesting because on the surface, it just seems so contradictory. We talk all the time about the strengths and talents that are so common among autistic people. But then there's this huge number of people on the spectrum who are dealing with imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome is basically just doubting your abilities all the time. So how can those two things, the strengths and the self-doubt, exist at the same time?
Right. It's like someone could be totally crushing it in their field. Like maybe they're amazing at solving problems, or they notice tiny details that everyone else misses, which are things that, people connect with autism all the time. But then inside, they still feel like they're totally faking it.
Yeah, exactly. One of the articles you guys sent in actually said that autistic people might be really good at things like analytical thinking, that kind of thing, but then they still struggle with this, intense self-doubt. It's almost like their brain is telling them, wait a minute, you don't really deserve this success.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I could see how that was so draining. Like, you'd always be second-guessing yourself. Have you ever felt that way? Even when you knew you were good at something. Like, oh, they only think I did a good job because...
Oh, totally. I think a lot of us deal with that. And if we really want to understand why autistic people experience this so much, we got to look at some specific factors. One that comes up a lot in what you sent us is this idea of social masking.
Okay, social masking. Can you break that down? What does that even mean?
So basically, it's this constant effort to change your behavior so that you fit in, with what neurotypical people expect. Sometimes it's a conscious choice, like you intentionally try to hide some of your autistic traits, but sometimes it's subconscious. You're not even aware you're doing it. It's just like a way of surviving in a world that wasn't really built for your neurotype. It's almost like you're putting on a performance all the time.
Yeah, I can see how that would be exhausting, feeling like you always have to play a role.
Yeah.
But how is that connected to imposter syndrome?
Well, the more you mask your true self, the more you might succeed in some environments. But it kind of reinforces this feeling of not being genuine. So you achieve these great things, but you're doing it while feeling like you're faking who you are. And there's actually research that shows this. In the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, some researchers found that masking is super common among autistic people. And this is important, that it can really hurt their mental health and well-being.
Wow, so it's like you're punished for trying to fit in, which just seems so unfair. And then on top of all of that, you've got the added challenge of sensory overload, which I'm guessing is more than just being annoyed by loud noises, right?
Yeah, think about like a typical office. Fluorescent lights buzzing above you.
Yeah.
Computers humming, people talking all around you, phones ringing. For most neurotypical folks, it's just background noise. But if you're really sensitive to sensory input, it can be completely overwhelming. Like your senses are just going into overdrive.
I can only imagine. I get overwhelmed just thinking about that. But how does that tie into this whole imposter thing?
Well, when you're constantly fighting sensory overload, it's really hard to focus and do your best work. And that can lead to a lot of self-doubt. You might think, I can't handle this. I'm not good enough. And that just feeds right into imposter syndrome. There's even a study, this one was in the International Journal of Neuroscience, and they found a really strong link between sensory overload and problems at work for autistic people. It's like this vicious cycle.
So you're struggling because of the environment, but then you start to think it's your fault. Like you're the one who's failing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And at a lot of workplaces, they just aren't designed to accommodate people with sensory differences.
You mean things like needing a quiet workspace?
Yeah.
Or maybe working from home sometimes.
Exactly. Without those kinds of accommodations, autistic people are constantly fighting an uphill battle. And that just makes them feel like, I'm not cutting it, I must be an imposter. And there's a ton of research out there about the need for better accommodations in the workplace for neurodivergent people. Like there was this study in the Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation that found, well, that study found that a lot of autistic people face barriers at work. And a lot of times it's because they don't have the accommodations they need. And this makes them feel like they're not good enough, like they don't belong. It really feeds into that imposter syndrome.
It's like
the system is set up to make you feel like an imposter. And it makes me wonder how many people, how much potential is being wasted just because workplaces aren't designed for neurodiversity. And all of it, it's only part of the picture, because then we have to consider internalized ableism, actually. I'm not even really sure what that means. Can you explain that one?
Sure. It's basically taking all the negative messages about disability that you hear from society and turning them inward. You start to believe all those stereotypes, and it can really damage your self-worth. Like, imagine growing up hearing that autistic people are difficult or that they lack social skills. You might start to believe that about yourself, even if it's not true.
So, you're not only dealing with external barriers, but also these internal beliefs telling you you're less than.
Yeah, unfortunately. And that makes it even easier to fall into the imposter syndrome trap.
Right, because even when you achieve something amazing.
Exactly. You might think, see, they were right about me?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not as capable as I pretend to be? Ugh. This is all pretty heavy stuff. But I think it's really important to talk about. So, knowing all this, what are the consequences of imposter syndrome? I mean, It can't just be a fleeting feeling, right? They have to have real impacts on people's lives.
It definitely does. One of the biggest consequences is the impact on mental health. We know that autistic people are already more likely to experience anxiety and depression, and imposter syndrome can make those conditions even worse.
That makes sense. I mean, if you're constantly feeling like you're not good enough, like you're going to be found out, it's got to take a toll on your mental health.
For sure. You're always worried about being exposed, never feeling like you're enough. It can lead to negative self-talk, avoiding social situations, even feeling hopeless. There was this study in the journal Autism, and they found a strong connection between imposter syndrome and increased anxiety and depression in autistic people.
Wow. That's really sad. Yeah. But it's important to talk about it because it shows how important it is to get support. And it's not just mental health that's affected, right?
Right.
This has to impact work life too.
Right. Absolutely. Imposter syndrome can really hurt job satisfaction, motivation, even productivity. Just imagine trying to focus on your work when you're constantly thinking, I'm going to be found out. Everyone's going to realize I don't belong here. It's so distracting.
Yeah.
And demoralizing.
Yeah. It's like having this little voice in your head that's always putting you down. I could see how it would be hard to focus on your work.
Totally. You might not speak up in meetings or ask for help or even go for a promotion, even if you deserve it.
Right, because you don't feel like you deserve it.
Exactly.
And our notes also mentioned social isolation. How does that fit in with imposter syndrome?
Well, think about it. If you're always afraid of being exposed as a fraud, it's hard to let people in. It's hard to form real connections. You might avoid social situations altogether because you're afraid of being judged or rejected.
Oh, wow. So it's not just that you doubt your abilities, you're also afraid to build relationships.
Exactly, because you're afraid people will see through you.
And the saddest part is that social isolation can actually make the imposter syndrome worse.
Right. It becomes this vicious cycle. There's actually a study in the International Journal of Autism and Affective Disorders, and they found a strong link between social isolation and increased anxiety, depression, and, you guessed it, imposter syndrome.
It's like one problem feeds into the other.
Yeah.
This has been a pretty intense conversation, but I think it's been so insightful. I know I'm learning a lot, and I bet our listeners are too.
I hope so. Talking about these issues is so important. It's the first step to creating positive change.
Totally. Before we finish up, though, I want to make sure our listeners leave with a sense of hope, because even though imposter syndrome is a real problem, it's not something you just have to live with forever.
Absolutely. There are things we can do to challenge these feelings and start to break free.
Okay, so let's get practical. What can our listeners do to start dealing with imposter syndrome in their own lives?
Yeah, there are definitely things you can do. I think one of the most important things is to remember that you're not alone in this. And knowing that can be really empowering. And from there, it's all about taking small steps
Towards building self-compassion and challenging those negative thoughts.
Okay, so what are some practical things our listeners can do to start tackling imposter syndrome?
Well, one really powerful strategy is to shift your focus to your strengths.
Yeah.
So instead of focusing on what you think you're bad at, make a conscious effort to acknowledge and celebrate your accomplishments. You could write them down, keep a journal, create a wins file on your computer, whatever works for you. The key is to actively remind yourself of the skills and talents you have.
Yeah, it's like flipping the script. Instead of buying into the I'm a fraud story, you're focusing on the evidence that you're actually good at things.
Exactly. And another important step is to connect with other autistic people.
Yeah, that makes sense. Finding community, whether it's online or in person, can give you a sense of belonging and validation. And that can be really helpful for dealing with imposter syndrome. knowing you're not alone, knowing that other people share your experiences, it can really help with those feelings of isolation and self-doubt.
That's so true. It's like knowing that other successful autistic people have dealt with the same thing. It makes it feel more normal.
Yeah, exactly.
What else can people do to deal with that sense of shame?
Well, we talked earlier about internalized ableism. Challenging those internalized beliefs is super important. So start questioning those negative messages that you've heard about autism. Seek out positive representations of neurodiversity. Surround yourself with people who celebrate your autistic identity.
It's like, Potter, you're reclaiming your own story instead of letting those negative stereotypes define you.
Exactly. And finally, don't be afraid to seek professional support. A therapist or counselor who specializes in working with neurodivergent people can give you tools and guidance to help you deal with imposter syndrome and build self-confidence.
So it's about finding what works for you.
Exactly.
Great. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. We've covered a lot today,
We have.
and it's been quite a journey. But I hope our listeners are leaving feeling informed and empowered, and maybe even a little more self-compassionate.
Absolutely. Remember, you're not alone,
Yeah.
and you're capable of amazing things.
Until next time, deep divers,
Yeah.
stay curious, stay kind to yourselves, and keep diving deep.